On an autumn evening in 1958, in the dining room of the Dorchester Hotel, a man sat opposite Sir John Mills and tried to stop his hands from trembling. Silver clinked softly against porcelain. Somewhere beyond the curtained windows, London hummed its evening hum: taxis, theatre queues, the distant grumble of a bus on Park Lane. But in here, everything was hushed and warm and smelled faintly of roast beef and confidence. The chandeliers cast a honeyed glow across white linen. Mills was talking. His wife Mary was smiling. The man across the table heard none of it. He was 41 years old, though he told everyone he was 36. The lie came easily. It was, by that point, among the smaller deceptions of his life. His name, the name the public knew at any rate, was Frankie Howerd. 5 years earlier, that name had been enough to fill any theatre in Britain. Now it could scarcely persuade a secretary to write it down. The BBC had stopped calling. His agents returned his letters with the particular politeness the English reserve for people they wish would disappear. The money was running out. The pills were not. He had been invited to this dinner out of kindness, the gentle, devastating kindness that successful men extend to those who have fallen from view. Then a young man approached the table carrying a bottle of wine. He was 28, slim, immaculately turned out. Of German origin, his family had come to England years before, and he had grown up knowing what it meant to carry a surname that did not quite belong. His name was Dennis Heymer, and he worked at the Dorchester. He presented the bottle. He poured. Their eyes met. What happens when the funniest man in Britain looks across a table and for the first time in 41 years does not want to make anyone laugh? Something happened in that moment, something so ordinary that no one else at the table registered it. A lightning strike of recognition. A vertiginous sense that, after decades of performing, here was a face before which performance was neither necessary nor possible. It would last 34 years, survive disgrace and triumph and despair, and remain utterly invisible to the outside world until long after both men were dead. But to understand what brought Francis Alec Howerd to that table, to those trembling hands, to that terror lodged in his throat like a fish bone, we must go back 41 years. To a freezing hospital in the city of York, where, on the 6th of March, 1917, while Europe choked on the blood of the Great War, a boy was born who would spend his entire life wearing 1,000 faces and never once showing his own. York in the spring of 1917 was a city of stone walls and cathedral spires, and a city in mourning, like every other in England, in the 3rd year of a war that had already swallowed a generation. In the city hospital, on a grey March morning, Edith Florence Howerd gave birth to a son. He was christened Francis Alec Howerd. His father, Frank Howerd Sr., was a soldier in the Royal Artillery, a man who had marched away to war like millions of others and who would return, like many of those who survived, with something missing behind the eyes, not a wound you could see, an absence, a door permanently closed. The family was working class, respectable, clean-curtained, scrubbed-step working class, not destitution, poverty with dignity. Edith saw to that. She was a Methodist, devout, fierce in her faith, and she ran her household with discipline, with love, and with an absolute conviction that appearances mattered. You could be poor, but you must not look poor. You could suffer, but you must not show it. You could be different, but heaven help you if anyone noticed. It was, in its way, the first lesson in performance that young Francis ever received. Long before he set foot on any stage, he watched his mother perform respectability on a budget of almost nothing, and he learned, the world is a theatre. The trick is never to let them see behind the curtain. There was also a younger sister, Betty, quiet, loyal, destined to become the one person who would defend her brother's memory decades later, when others tried to rewrite his story with cruelties he did not deserve. And there was Frank Sr., or rather, the space where a father should have been. He was not cruel. A television drama broadcast in 2008 would later hint at something darker, and both Betty and Dennis Heymer publicly, furiously rejected the suggestion. Frank Howerd was simply not present. He went to work. He came home. He sat. He said little. He was one of those men the war had hollowed out, visible but unreachable, there but not there. In his entire life, Frankie almost never mentioned his father. Not with anger, not with grief, with silence. And silence, as anyone who has lived with it knows, is the loudest sound in any house. In 1922 or thereabouts, the family moved south to Eltham, in southeast London. Francis, a thin, anxious boy, started school. And school was where the trouble began. He stuttered. Not the gentle hesitation that many children outgrow, but a genuine, grinding stammer that locked his jaw and strangled his words, and turned every classroom recitation into a public execution. The other children laughed. Of course they did. Children are not deliberately cruel, but honesty at 8 years old has no mercy, and the sight of a boy wrestling with a sentence as though it were a live animal is, to an 8-year-old, hilarious. Francis learned something in that schoolyard. He learned it the way an animal learns which berries are poison, through pain, through repetition. What he learned was this: they are going to laugh anyway, so you might as well decide what they laugh at. He wanted, with a longing that burned in him for the rest of his life, to be a serious actor, not a clown. An actor. He wanted to be Laurence Olivier. He wanted to stand center stage at the Old Vic and hold an audience in the palm of his hand with nothing but Shakespeare's words and his own treacherous voice. He applied to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. He auditioned. He waited. And then a quiet word at the end of a corridor. "Thank you, Mr. Howard. That will be all," and the door closed, and his footsteps echoed on the stairs, and Rada went on without him. He never forgot it. Every laugh he ever earned, every standing ovation, every Royal Variety performance, somewhere inside, a small, furious voice was saying to the ghosts of every admissions panel that had ever turned him away, "Look at me now. But you will never, ever know how much it cost." Meanwhile, in the spaces between school and homework and chapel on Sundays, something else was stirring. Something he could not name, could not explain, and desperately wished would stop. He was not like the other boys. A feeling. A direction of the gaze. A quickening of the pulse that came at the wrong moments for the wrong reasons. He knew, with the instinct of a child who has watched his mother perform normality, that this must never be seen. He prayed. Edith prayed beside him. According to Dennis Heymer, speaking to the BBC in 2007, Frankie was still whispering, "God, make me normal at 60. In 1934, Frank Howerd Sr. died. Francis was 17. If he grieved, he left no record of it, not in the autobiography he published in 1976, not in interviews, not in private conversation. The father who had been absent in life was absent in death, too. For the next 5 years, Francis worked as a clerk at the Prudential Insurance Company. Grey suit, grey desk, slow suffocation. In the evenings, he escaped to the music halls of South London and sat in the cheap seats, studying comedians, timing their pauses, noting when the audience leaned forward and when it settled back. He did not yet know he was learning, but his mind was already dismantling the machinery, examining each gear and spring, working out how the trick was done. Then, on the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain was at war. And here was a paradox so vast it swallowed everything that came before. The war that killed millions saved Frankie Howerd, because the army gave him the one thing that Rada and Prudential and Eltham and his mother's prayers had not, a stage. He enlisted in the Royal Artillery. Bombardier Howard endured the same tedium and discomfort as every other soldier. But the army needed more than shells and tinned beef. It needed entertainment. The Entertainment's National Service Association, ENSA, which the soldiers cheerfully decoded as "every night something awful," organized concerts in mess halls and makeshift theaters from Aldershot to Algiers. And Francis Howard discovered that he was a very willing fool indeed. He stood before audiences of soldiers, men in khaki, smelling of boot polish and cigarettes, and the particular sourness of people who have not slept properly in weeks, and he talked. Or rather, he tried to talk. He stumbled, he stammered, he lost his thread. He started a joke, got halfway through, forgot the punchline, apologized, started again. And then, somehow, by some alchemy he himself could barely explain, the punchline arrived and the room roared. He had discovered the secret. His nervousness, his verbal struggle, his visible suffering on stage, they were funny. The audience did not laugh at the joke. They laughed at the spectacle of a man fighting for his life against words that would not obey him. It was, in a certain light, cruel, but it worked, every single time. On the 6th of June 1944, D-Day, Frankie was aboard one of the ships in the invasion armada. The engines throbbed. The sea was grey. Men vomited over the side and prayed. Somewhere on the beach, history was happening, but he did not set foot on the sand. A logistical snarl, a blocked gangway, a confusion of orders. He was not a coward. He was simply unlucky or lucky, depending on your point of view. But the detail lodged in his story like a splinter. Frankie Howerd was always close to the great events, but never quite at the center. The observer, the commentator, the man standing to one side describing the parade as it passed. It was also during his army years that he changed his name. Howard became Howard, one letter. Too many Howards, he explained later, with a glint that might have been amusement. Trevor Howard, Sidney Howard, Leslie Howard. You couldn't move for Howards. So I changed the spelling. Howard, with an E, different. He paused. Unique. The audience laughed. No one considered the possibility that I wanted to be different was not a joke but a mission statement, the summary of an entire existence in 6 words. The change was small, but it was an act of creation. Francis Alec Howard stepped into the shadows. In his place stood Frankie Howerd, a character, a construction, a name with a deliberate misspelling that signaled, to anyone paying attention, that nothing about this man was quite what it seemed. In 1946, the soldiers came home. London was a city of rubble and rationing. Millions of men in cheap demobilization suits were looking for work, for housing, for a reason to get up in the morning. Among them was Frankie Howerd, 29 years old, with no qualifications, no connections, and one asset. He could make people laugh. In a nation that was exhausted, grieving, and thoroughly fed up, This was worth more than a degree. His chance came through BBC Radio. Variety Bandbox gave him a slot. He stepped up to the microphone, and what the listeners heard, crackling through the valves of their wireless sets in kitchens and parlours from London to Edinburgh, was something they had never encountered before. A typical routine began with him shuffling to the microphone, looking at the audience with an expression of bewildered suspicion, and saying, "No, no, don't look at me like that. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, he's not going to be funny, is he? Well, I'll tell you something." Long pause. "You might be right." The audience howled. He looked hurt. They howled louder. He had not told a joke. He had told the truth. And the truth, delivered with precisely the right pause in precisely the right voice, was funnier than any joke could ever be. This is perhaps the single most important fact about his art, confirmed by the comedian Barry Cryer, who worked with him, and proven beyond doubt by the archive of handwritten scripts transferred to the University of York in 2021. Every pause was scripted. Every stammer was planned. Every 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 aside to the audience was written down in advance, timed to the half-second. This was not a comedian. This was a watchmaker, assembling a mechanism of hilarity with the precision of a Swiss craftsman. The highest form of mastery is the ability to appear as though you have none. By 1950, Frankie Howerd was one of the most recognized voices in Britain. He performed at the Royal Variety Performance on the 13th of November 1950 at the London Palladium before King George VI, a sick, fading monarch who had perhaps 2 years left to live. The comedian stood on the stage, and the crown watched, and the clown watched back. Two men in costumes, two performances of something that was expected of them. He had fame. He had money. He had adoration. He bought his mother a house. He sent her flowers every Friday. He was the nation's favorite, the voice that made you smile before he had even said anything. And he was, by any measure that matters, utterly alone. Because all of it, every ovation, every pound, every photograph, belonged to Frankie Howerd. And Francis Alec Howerd, the real man, sat inside that creation like a prisoner in a cell, listening to the world applaud someone who did not exist. He had everything, except the one thing that makes everything else worthwhile. But that absence had not yet acquired a name, or a face, or a pair of hands pouring wine at a table in the Dorchester. That was still 8 years away. In 1885, Parliament had passed the Criminal Law Amendment Act. Section 11, just a few lines of dry legal prose, made gross indecency between males a criminal offence punishable by up to 2 years' imprisonment with hard labour. It was this clause that had destroyed Oscar Wilde in 1895. It remained on the statute books. It did not sleep. It waited, patient as a man-trap, for the next foot to fall. In 1952, that foot belonged to Alan Turing. Turing was, by any rational measure, one of the most important human beings of the 20th century. His work at Bletchley Park, cracking the Enigma code, building the intellectual foundations of the modern computer, had shortened the war by an estimated 2 years and saved millions of lives. He was also, in the eyes of the law he had served so brilliantly, a criminal. In January 1952, he reported a burglary at his home in Manchester. The police investigation led, by a chain of questions and admissions, to his acknowledgement of a sexual relationship with a young man. He was charged. He was convicted. He was offered a choice: prison or chemical castration. He chose the hormones, They injected him with estrogen. His body changed. On the 7th of June, 1954, Alan Turing was found dead in his bedroom. Beside him lay an apple laced with cyanide. He was 41 years old. The state had already killed him. The poison was merely a formality. Frankie did not know Turing personally, but they inhabited the same country. They carried the same secret. And every time the comedian opened a morning newspaper and read about another arrest, another trial, another man dragged through the courts for the crime of loving the wrong person, he saw his own name. Not printed there. Not yet. But possible. One mistake. One indiscretion. One moment of trust placed in the wrong hands. Then it happened to someone even closer to his world. In October 1953, the newspapers carried a small, devastating item. Sir John Gielgud, Knight, National Treasure, one of the supreme Shakespearean actors of the English-speaking world, had been arrested in a public lavatory in Chelsea. The charge: persistently importuning male persons. The fine was £10. The humiliation was incalculable. Gielgud's career wobbled, then steadied, because Gielgud was protected by the invisible armor of class and connection. But Frankie Howerd was not Sir John Gielgud. He was working class, Eltham, prudential. For a man of his background caught in the same trap, there would be no discreet telephone calls, no understanding magistrate. There would be the front page of the Daily Mirror, and then nothing. 1954 brought the case that shook the foundations. Lord Montagu of Beaulieu, a peer of the realm, was prosecuted alongside Michael Pittrivers and journalist Peter Wildeblood for homosexual offences. Peer guilty ran the headline in the Daily Express, in letters designed to be read from across the room. Montagu received 12 months. The message was unambiguous. No one was safe, not even a baron. In the wake of these cases, a wave of panic swept through the homosexual community, a community that had no name, no organization, and no defense except invisibility. Blackmail flourished. If you were a man who loved men, you could be bled dry by anyone who discovered your secret, because you feared the police more than you feared the blackmailer. The police knew this. They found it convenient. And here we enter territory that is documented fact, confirmed by government archives declassified in the early 2000s. MI5 and Metropolitan Police Special Branch had intensified their surveillance of known homosexuals in public life. The connection, in the paranoid logic of Cold War intelligence, was strategic. Guy Burgess, who had defected to Moscow in 1951, was openly homosexual. The conclusion drawn was brutally simple. A homosexual man could be blackmailed, and a man who could be blackmailed could be turned. The logic was circular, since blackmail existed only because the law criminalized homosexuality in the first place, but within its own mad framework, it was lethal. Lists were kept. Files were compiled. The BBC maintained what insiders called Christmas tree files, a system of flagging individuals deemed unreliable. Was Frankie Howerd on those lists? There is no direct evidence, but consider the arithmetic. One of the most recognizable men in Britain, a secret homosexual, promiscuous by his own partner's later admission, connected to high society through royal variety dinners with knights and peers. By MI5's own criteria, this was a textbook candidate for surveillance. We do not assert, we ask. And we note that throughout his entire life, across 46 years in the public eye, Frankie Howerd was never arrested, never charged, never cautioned. Gielgud was caught. Montagu was prosecuted, Turing was destroyed, but Frankie never. Luck, caution, or something else, something belonging to the realm of the unwritten, the merely suggested. We shall never know. What we do know is that in the mid-1950s, his career collapsed. It happened with the particular swiftness that the entertainment industry reserves for those it has decided to forget. A new generation of comedians had arrived, Tony Hancock, the Goons, and they made Frankie seem old-fashioned. Television was replacing radio, and on screen, his heavy face and anxious eyes were not endearing but uncomfortable. Producers stopped calling. The timing raises a question that must be asked even if it cannot be answered. His career did not decline gradually. It fell off a cliff between 1954 and 1956, precisely the period of the Montagu trial, the Gielgud scandal, and the intensification of surveillance. Coincidence? The natural cycle of public taste? Or could someone, not with a memorandum, but with a raised eyebrow over sherry at the Athenaeum, have suggested that Mr. Howerd was not entirely sound, not a man to be promoted? We note the chronology and wonder what followed was disintegration. Depression settled over him like fog. He could not sleep. He drank whiskey mostly. He took barbiturates to quiet the noise, then more. His mother watched her son crumble and did not understand why. He could not tell her. He was carrying two burdens simultaneously: the public collapse of a career, which everyone could see, and the private terror of his nature, which no one could see and which weighed 1,000 times more. And then, in an act of desperation, he submitted to something that stripped away every defense he had spent a lifetime constructing. A psychiatrist prescribed LSD. This is confirmed fact, attested by Heymer in his BBC interview and documented in Graham McCann's biography. In the 1950s, lysergic acid diethylamide was a legal, medically sanctioned tool of psychotherapy. Here was a man whose entire existence was built on control, every pause timed, every stammer rehearsed, and he voluntarily took a substance that dissolved control like acid dissolves metal. What happened during those sessions? Which faces surfaced when the pharmaceutical tide came in and washed the defenses out to sea? His mother singing hymns, his father saying nothing, his own face, the real one, finally nakedly exposed. We do not know. Heymer never described the sessions in detail, but we know that a man who feared exposure more than death lay down on a couch week after week and allowed a chemical to peel him open. This was not treatment. This was surrender. The white flag of a man who had run out of trenches to hide in, and alongside the LSD, alongside the barbiturates, there was sex. Heymer later described Frankie's private life with a bluntness that left no room for euphemism: outrageously promiscuous, hurried encounters, furtive, dangerous. In an era when each such meeting could end in arrest. But loneliness is more frightening than prison, and each nameless partner offered something that nothing else in his life could provide. 1 minute without a history. 1 minute in which the elaborate construction of Frankie Howerd could be set aside, and there was only a body, warm, present, briefly free. Not free in any real sense. Free in the way a man is free during a fall before the ground arrives. Now return to the Dorchester. The dates do not quite match, and that, in a love story, is worth a moment's thought. Some sources place the meeting in 1955, with Heymer working as a waiter. Others specify 1958 and the Dorchester, with Heymer as sommelier. 3 years difference. But for two people who would spend more than 3 decades together, what did it matter? What mattered was that he came to the table, and that he stayed. Their eyes met. Something passed between them, something that Heymer, with characteristic economy, would later describe in just 3 words. We just clicked. 3 words for the beginning of 34 years. 3 words that contained an entire universe of risk, of tenderness, and of the peculiar courage required to love someone in a country that had made such love a crime. For this was the terrible thing. A casual liaison could be denied. A nameless partner could be forgotten. But love left traces. Love was an address, a shared house, a second toothbrush, a voice answering the telephone. Love was evidence that could not be destroyed, and Frankie knew this. He knew that what he felt in that dining room was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to him. He stepped forward anyway, because the emptiness was worse than the dread. Heymer left the hotel business. He moved in with Frankie. He became, in rapid succession, his manager, his cook, his driver, his nurse, his shield against the world, and the only human being on earth permitted to see Francis Alec Howard without the grease paint on. The official explanation, my manager, my companion, was a code, a password that the whole country understood and agreed not to translate. The English have a genius for this kind of courtesy. We know, but we shall not say, provided you do not oblige us to see. In 75 years of life, Francis Alec Howard never married. Not once. No ceremony, no ring, no vows before witnesses. His mother waited in the way that mothers do. The press did not inquire. A bachelor was simply a bachelor in those years. Married to his work, people said. It was the most convenient disguise of all. What Heymer did in those first months was nothing short of reconstruction. He cleared the debts, negotiated with agents who had stopped returning calls, stood between his partner's fragile psyche and the merciless machinery of show business. He drove him to the psychiatrist. He sat in the waiting room. He drove him home. He cooked dinner. He ironed shirts. He walked the dogs. He answered fan letters. He did all of this every day for 34 years, without a single public word of acknowledgement, without a photograph in any newspaper, without the right to say, even to his own family, what Frankie was to him and he to Frankie. The words were reported by Heymer himself, spoken to the BBC. Frankie had said them to Cilla Black, one of the very few people admitted to the inner circle. I wish to God I wasn't gay. He wanted a wife, children, Sunday roasts. The whole apparatus of normality that his mother had prayed for and the law had demanded. He wanted, with a sincerity that broke Heymer's heart, to be someone else. And Heymer heard it. His partner, the man he had reorganized his entire life around, telling the world, I wish that instead of you there were a different face, different hands, a different kind of love. And after hearing this, Heymer went to the kitchen and cooked dinner, because Frankie liked fish on Thursdays, and because Dennis loved him, even when love meant being the thing the beloved wished away. But Heymer's steadiness, his quiet, relentless competence, began to produce results. The machinery of a stalled career slowly, painfully, began to turn again, not because the world had changed, but because behind the performer, for the first time, there was someone holding the scaffolding in place. The year was 1962, and two things happened that would alter the course of Frankie Howerd's life in opposite directions. One, a devastation, the other, a deliverance. His mother died. Edith Florence Howard, the Methodist, the matriarch, the woman who had taught him that poverty must be concealed and suffering must be silent was gone. She was the last living connection to Francis Alec Howard, to the boy from Eltham, to the chapel hymns and the starched collars. With her death, the final thread between the real man and his act snapped. There was no one left for whom he was simply a son. But there was another layer, darker, harder to speak of. With Edith's death, the last source of shame also disappeared. Her voice, the voice that had prayed for his normality, fell silent. This was not relief. It was emptiness, because shame, at least, connected him to someone who was alive. Emptiness connected him to no one at all. And yet, in the precise, cruel mathematics of fate, it was in this same year that the telephone began to ring again. A young man named David Frost had an idea, and the idea needed Frankie Howerd. David Frost was 23 years old, ferociously ambitious, and in possession of an idea that would change British television. Though in 1962, nobody yet knew he would become Sir David, the most formidable interviewer of his generation. The program was called That Was the Week, that was TW3 for short, and it proposed something the BBC had never quite dared: political satire with teeth. Sharp, fast, irreverent, aimed squarely at the establishment that the BBC had spent decades politely serving. It debuted in November 1962 and ran until December 1963, and in that brief, electric window, it redrew the boundaries of what was permissible on British screens. Frost needed performers. He assembled a team of young, clever, dangerous talents, writers and actors who could puncture pomposity and make the audience feel they were witnessing something illicit. And then, with an instinct that bordered on genius, he invited a man who was none of these things. A man who was not young, not fashionable, not part of any movement. A man of 45 whose career was, by general consensus, finished. Frankie Howerd walked onto the set of TW3 and discovered that the world had not moved on from him. It had circled back. His style, that stammering, apparently chaotic assault on coherence, turned out to be the perfect complement to the new satire. The young performers were slick. Frankie was not slick. He was a glorious, calculated, meticulously engineered mess, and the mess was exactly what the program needed. He was the bridge between the old music hall and the new television, between the generation of fathers and the generation of sons. And when he stood before the camera and fumbled and stumbled and looked at the audience with that expression of bewildered innocence that concealed a mind working like a steel trap, something clicked. A new generation discovered that this apparently old-fashioned man was funnier, sharper, and more subversive than all the bright young things put together. The resurrection had begun. In 1963, while TW3 was still running, Frankie opened in the West End production of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, a musical by Stephen Sondheim set in ancient Rome, built around the figure of Pseudolus, a slave. A cunning, quick-witted, endlessly scheming slave whose single, overwhelming desire was freedom. The role fitted Frankie like a second skin, or more precisely, like a first skin worn beneath the second. Every night he walked onto the stage of the Strand Theatre and played a man in chains who dreamt of liberation, and the audience roared with laughter, and the critics praised his timing, his physicality, his astonishing command of the house. He was not merely playing a slave who longed for freedom. He was one. None of the critics appeared to notice the irony. None seemed to register that the performer, a man shackled by a secret that could destroy him at any moment, was not merely acting. He was testifying. Every night, before 1,000 people who adored him, he stood center stage and told them exactly what his life was like, and they applauded, and he bowed, and the truth retreated behind the grease paint, and the next performance began. In the world beyond the theatre, Britain was tearing itself apart over a scandal that proved, if proof were needed, that the establishment was rotten beneath its polished surface. John Profumo, the Secretary of State for War, had lied to Parliament about his relationship with Christine Keeler. Sex, espionage, deception. Britain in 1963 was waking up to the fact that powerful men wore faces behind their faces. Hypocrisy was not the exception, it was the system. And Frankie Howerd, master of hypocrisy by necessity, stood on stage every evening and winked at the audience. I know something you don't. Or rather, I know something you do, but we have all agreed not to say it. The 1960s carried him upward. Television appearances multiplied. Film roles followed, modest parts in modest comedies, none of them remarkable, all of them profitable. And then, in 1969, the BBC offered him a role that would define him for the rest of his life and long beyond it. Up Pompeii was set in ancient Pompeii, the city in the shadow of Vesuvius, the city whose inhabitants saw the smoking volcano every morning and every evening and chose, with the magnificent obstinacy of the human animal, to ignore it. Frankie played Lucio, a slave in a Roman household. The format was deceptively simple. Lucio addressed the audience directly, breaking the fourth wall with a casualness that made it seem as though the wall had never existed. He commented on the sexual escapades of his masters. He delivered innuendos of such elaborate construction that they qualified as architectural achievements. And when the audience laughed, which they did, helplessly, continuously, he pulled a face of scandalized innocence and uttered 3 words that would become his epitaph. Titter ye not. Those 3 words require examination because they were not simply a catchphrase. They were a key to his act, to his persona, and to his entire life. The mechanism was precise. Frankie would say something outrageously suggestive. The audience would erupt. He would assume an expression of wounded dignity, eyebrows raised, mouth pursed, a picture of offended virtue. No, 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 titter ye not, I am being serious. The audience would laugh harder. He would look more affronted. The cycle would repeat endlessly, each iteration more absurd than the last. But listen to what he was actually doing. With every raised eyebrow, every double meaning, every exaggerated gasp of mock horror, he was saying, "Look at me. I am not what I appear." There is something beneath this surface that you are not seeing, or that you are seeing and choosing to ignore. He was showing the truth, and then, in the same breath, snatching it back, revealing and concealing in a single gesture, crying out and silencing himself simultaneously. And the millions who watched, in their sitting rooms, with their cups of tea, on a weekday evening, laughed without the faintest suspicion that they were laughing at a plea for help dressed up as a punchline. He was not the only man behind an act in the comedy world of those decades. The carry-on films, that long-running series of broad, bawdy, relentlessly cheerful comedies, employed a repertory company of performers, several of whom were fighting private battles that the public never saw. Kenneth Williams, who appeared in 26 carry-on films, was a closeted homosexual whose diaries, published after his death, constitute one of the most harrowing documents in the history of British show business. Page after page of self-loathing, loneliness, and a despair so profound that the jokes he told on screen read, in retrospect, like messages in bottles thrown from a sinking ship. Charles Hawtrey, another carry-on regular, was gay, alcoholic, and so difficult to work with that he was eventually expelled from the series. He would die in 1988, alone and impoverished, in a seaside town in Kent, forgotten by the industry that had used him up and moved on. Behind the bright, bawdy facade lay a graveyard of broken lives. The screen laughed. The people behind it wept. And the audience, bless them, curse them, never noticed. The metaphor of Pompeii was almost too perfect. A city that saw the volcano every single day, the thin column of smoke, the occasional tremor underfoot, the smell of sulfur on certain evenings, and chose to carry on, to trade, to love, to feast, to scrawl poetry on the walls of brothels. Until one August afternoon in 79 AD, the pretending stopped, and the ash fell, and the city was buried. Frankie's life was Pompeii. The volcano was always visible, the tremor was always underfoot, and he carried on. On the 27th of July, 1967, the Sexual Offences Act received royal assent. Homosexual acts between men aged 21 or over, conducted in private, were decriminalised in England and Wales. Not in Scotland, where the law would remain unchanged until 1980. Not in Northern Ireland, which would wait until 1982. Not in the armed forces. Not in practical terms, anywhere that a third person might conceivably be present. The bitter arithmetic of the aftermath has been documented by historians. Following decriminalisation, the number of arrests for gross indecency and importuning in England did not decrease, it increased. The police interpreted the new law with surgical narrowness. What was permitted? Two men over 21 behind a locked door with no one else present. What remained criminal? Everything else. The freedom granted by Parliament was not freedom, it was parole. You were out of the cell, but any constable could put you back. For Frankie Howerd, the act changed nothing. He did not come out. He did not speak publicly. He did not adjust a single word of his performances. The disguise remained in place, fused to his features like scar tissue. 21 years of unbroken terror do not evaporate because a queen signs a document. The grooves worn into the mind by 2 decades of vigilance, the constant scanning of faces for suspicion, the habitual lies, the reflexive concealment, do not smooth themselves out overnight. The disguise was no longer an accessory. It had become load-bearing. Remove it and the structure collapses. And his mother's voice was not dead. Edith had been gone for 5 years, but the Methodist hymns still echoed. God, make him normal. To come out would have been to betray her memory, to prove that God had not answered, to confirm that her son was the thing she had spent a lifetime praying he was not. He would sooner have betrayed the whole world, the BBC, the audience, the critics, England itself, his own sanity than her. Even with Heymer, the one person on earth who knew him without pretense, Frankie forbade any discussion of their relationship with anyone. Heymer could not tell his own family, could not mention it to mutual friends, could not use the word partner in any context, public or private. 34 years together, and not once, not a single time, did Dennis Heymer publicly speak the word love in connection with Frankie Howerd. Not until after his death. Not until 2007, 15 years later, and even then carefully, quietly. Like a man who had forgotten the sound of his own voice, because 3.5 decades of enforced silence had taught him that some words are too dangerous to say aloud. The law had changed. The world had not. Now consider the domestic life, because the domestic life is where the armor comes off, or should. Frankie and Dennis bought a house. It was called Wavering Down, and it stood in the village of Cross in Somerset, a county of green hills and stone walls and a silence so deep you could hear the grass grow. The name, if you stop to think about it, carried an unintended resonance. Wavering down, a wavering descent. Towards what? Peace, old age, truth. The house was stone-built, solid, surrounded by garden. There were dogs. Frankie loved dogs with the uncomplicated devotion that people who find human relationships impossibly tangled often reserve for animals. There was a kitchen where Heymer cooked, expertly, from years of hotel training. There was a sitting room where Frankie slumped in an armchair with a cup of tea and a script, crossing out lines, scribbling notes, muttering to himself. To the village of Cross, they were Mr. Howerd and his secretary, Mr. Heymer. Two men of established habits and no visible wives. The village, of course, understood perfectly. The village, of course, said nothing. This was the English way. We see, but we do not look. We know, but we do not say. We smile at you in the shop and wish you good morning, and never, under any circumstances, pronounce aloud the thing we all know to be true. It was not cruelty, it was courtesy. And Frankie, who had spent his entire life relying on precisely this kind of courteous blindness, found in it a kind of safety, not freedom. Safety is not freedom, but it was better than dread. Their daily life was not a drama but a routine. Heymer cooked. Frankie complained about the creases in his shirts. Dennis, did you iron this with an iron or a tank? And then a beat later, softer, sorry, the shirt's fine. Heymer smiled. Frankie looked away. The dogs settled at their feet every evening. The kettle whistled at 7:15 every morning. It was not a great love story in the Hollywood sense. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping music, no declarations on rain-soaked airfields. It was a great love story in the only sense that matters. Two people who remained together not because it was beautiful, but because, without each other, it was impossible. There was, however, a complication. His name was Lee Young. Young was a comic actor, a writer, and a fact confirmed by multiple biographical sources, a former boyfriend of Frankie's. The relationship had ended, but the professional connection had not. It was Lee Young who wrote Whoops Baghdad, a 6-episode BBC sitcom broadcast in 1973 in which Frankie played, once again, a wily servant in an exotic setting. The reviews were savage. But the production itself was less interesting than the geometry of the people involved. Frankie, on camera, delivering lines written by a man he had once slept with, while Heymer waited backstage, managing schedules and ironing shirts. Three men bound by intimacy, history, and professional necessity, and by a silence that none of them ever broke. The films came and went. Up Pompeii was adapted for the cinema in 1971, followed by Up the Chastity Belt the same year and Up the Front in 72. Moderate box office, dismissive reviews, dated, vulgar, yesterday's man. Heymer later revealed that after every hostile notice, Frankie did not sleep for 2 nights. Not from vanity, from a terror that went deeper than vanity. Every bad review was a step closer to irrelevance, and irrelevance was a step closer to the question he dreaded most. If they stop looking at the clown, what will they see instead? In 1977, a letter arrived from Buckingham Palace. Frankie Howerd was to receive the Order of the British Empire. The ceremony was at the palace. He wore his best suit. He bowed before the Queen. He said the right words in the right order. Photographs appeared in the newspapers the following morning. Frankie Howerd, OBE, smiling, holding the medal. Dennis Heymer was not in the photographs. He waited in the car outside the palace gates, with a flask of tea and a dog that had chewed through one of the seat belts. This was his life, an Order of the British Empire and a dog with a taste for upholstery. Not invited, not mentioned, not visible in any frame, on any page, in any caption. An honour pinned to the chest, and beside the honoured man, an empty space where the person who had made that honour possible should have been standing. In 1976, on tour in Canada, Frankie gave an impromptu masterclass in comic timing to a young performer named Gary Files. The lesson was simple. Frankie stood before him, raised one finger and said, "Wait." Silence. Files shifted on his feet. "Wait," said Frankie again, more silence. The silence became uncomfortable, then unbearable. Then, just as Files was about to speak, "Now, say it now." And Files said his line, and the empty room erupted with a laughter that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "You see," said Frankie, "the pause does the work. You just have to trust it." It was, in its way, a summary of everything he knew about comedy and about life. Wait, endure the discomfort, trust the silence, and then speak. In 1978, Hollywood called. A film based on the Beatles' SGT, Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, sprawling, expensive, star-studded. Frankie was cast as mean Mr. Mustard. The budget was vast. The ambition was colossal. The result was one of the most spectacular disasters in the history of cinema. Critics competed to find new ways of expressing their contempt. For Frankie, it was another door opened and slammed. Hollywood had beckoned, and Hollywood had discarded him. The pattern repeated: ascent, hope, collapse, and each time beside him in the wreckage, Heymer, offering a hand, pouring a drink, saying nothing that needed to be said because everything that needed to be said had been said years ago without a single word in a dining room at the Dorchester. By the early 1980s, the carousel had slowed again. Punk rock, the new wave, Margaret Thatcher, the Falklands War, Britain was transforming itself at speed, and Frankie was no longer part of the transformation. He was past 60, though he would never have admitted it, and television had stopped ringing. Concert halls were half empty. The money was thinning. He was becoming what the entertainment industry most dreads, a relic. A name that prompted the response, "Oh, is he still alive?" And then a new plague arrived, one that turned the act from a choice into a matter of life and death. From 1981, a new word entered the vocabulary of fear. AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, had been identified in the United States, and within months it had crossed the Atlantic and settled into the British consciousness like a stain spreading across white cloth. The tabloid press, never reluctant to weaponize terror, found in the epidemic a gift, a disease that killed, that was associated with homosexuality, and that could be reported with a combination of moral outrage and barely concealed satisfaction. The Sun ran headlines about the gay plague. The Daily Mail called it a moral reckoning. In 1987, Diana, Princess of Wales, shook the hand of a man dying of AIDS in a London hospital, and the gesture was considered so extraordinary, so contrary to the prevailing hysteria, that it made front pages around the world. That a handshake could be an act of courage tells you everything about the climate of those years. In the stone house in Somerset, two men sat in front of the television and watched the news. One of them, the one the whole country thought of as a lovable uncle, a harmless old comedian, a relic of cozier times, understood, with a clarity that no bulletin could convey, what was happening. The world that had laughed at his jokes despised people like him. The audiences who had applauded his innuendos, who had howled at his raised eyebrows, who had taken him into their homes every weekday evening, those same audiences, given certain information, would have turned away. The disguise had always been a necessity. Now it was a matter of survival in a new and more visceral sense. Before, it had protected him from the law. Now it protected him from a hatred that called itself righteousness. Margaret Thatcher's government was not merely an economic revolution. It was a moral one. Family values, church, order, discipline, the restoration of a Britain that had supposedly existed before the permissive 60s ruined everything. In 1988, this moral program found its legislative expression in Section 28 of the Local Government Act, which prohibited local authorities from promoting homosexuality and schools from presenting same-sex relationships as a pretended family relationship. The clause was passed with Thatcher's explicit support. It would not be repealed until 2003, 11 years after Frankie's death. For a 71-year-old man, though the world believed him to be 66, Section 28 was confirmation of something he had always known. England had not changed. The law of 1967 had been a half measure, a door opened 6 inches and then wedged shut. There was no freedom. There never had been. There was only the disguise, and the older you grew, the heavier it became. The deaths had been accumulating around him for years, not all at once, but one by one, each crash shaking the ground a little more. Tony Hancock, the greatest radio comedian of his generation, depressive, alcoholic, fatally self-destructive, had killed himself in Sydney in 1968. An overdose of barbiturates, washed down with vodka. He was 44. He left a note. Things just seemed to go too wrong too many times. 20 years later, it was Charles Hawtrey's turn. Star of 14 carry-on films. Gay, alcoholic, impossible to work with. He had retreated to Deal, on the Kent coast, where he lived alone in increasing squalor, drinking, quarrelling with neighbours. He died in October 1988, aged 73. His estate was valued at almost nothing. And then, on the 15th of April, 1988, 5 months before Hawtrey, Kenneth Williams. Williams was Frankie's mirror, a closeted gay man, a comedian of extraordinary verbal precision and physical expressiveness. A man who made millions laugh and who went home every night to a small flat in Marylebone and wrote, in a diary he never intended to be published, entries of such scorching self-hatred that reading them, decades later, requires a certain kind of courage. What's the point? He wrote, again and again, in different words, but always the same meaning. What is the point of getting up? What is the point of performing? What is the point of being alive when being alive means being this person in this body, with this longing that the world calls sin and the law calls crime and the tabloids call plague? His last diary entry read, "Oh, what's the bloody point?" He was found dead the following morning, barbiturate overdose. The coroner returned an open verdict. Suicide could not be proven, but neither could it be ruled out. He was 62. The difference between Kenneth Williams and Frankie Howerd was not talent or temperament or the depth of their suffering. The difference was Dennis Heymer. Williams had no Heymer. He had no one to drive him to the psychiatrist. No one to cook dinner and walk the dogs and answer the telephone and absorb the blows and hold the scaffolding in place while the structure swayed. He had no hand to reach for in the dark, and so he fell. British comedy in the 20th century was the funniest in the world. It was also the most expensive. The price of the laughter was the life of the clown. Frankie survived. He survived because Heymer refused to let him fall. But survival is not the same as living, and by the middle of the 1980s, Frankie Howerd was surviving no more, no less. Forgotten by the public, ignored by television, his name a quiz show answer rather than a headline. Heymer saw this. Quietly, methodically, with the patient determination that had rebuilt the finances and the career and the daily routine once before, he began to engineer a counterattack. In 1987, a television special called Super Frank was broadcast. Behind the scenes, it was Heymer who had lobbied, persuaded, and maneuvered, calling producers, writing letters, making the case that Frankie Howerd was not finished, was not a museum piece, was not yesterday's man. The special aired on Channel 4. And something remarkable happened. A new generation discovered him. University students, the children of those who had roared at Up Pompeii. Too young to remember the wireless years, but old enough to recognize comic genius when they saw it, stumbled upon this strange, elderly man with the heavy face and the stammer, and the habit of speaking directly to the camera as though it were a co-conspirator. And he was funny, not nostalgically funny, not ironically funny, not funny in the way that old things are sometimes funny because they remind you of your grandparents. Funny. Genuinely, immediately, right now in this moment funny. The hesitations, the double takes, the outraged innocence, they worked. They worked in 1987 just as they had worked in 1946 because they were not topical and they were not dated. They were human, and human does not expire. University tour followed, standing ovations. Sold-out halls. At a university hall in the late 1980s, the exact venue is disputed, as so many things in his life are. Frankie walked onto the stage, looked at the audience of 20-year-olds and said nothing. 5 seconds. 10. 15. A student coughed. Frankie turned to look at the cougher with an expression of such operatic disappointment that the room collapsed. He had not said a word. He had not moved. He had simply stood there and allowed the silence to do what silence does best, create expectation. And then, when the expectation was at breaking point, he murmured, "Well, this is going well, isn't it?" And the hall shook. Students who had come ironically left converted. 3 collapses, 3 resurrections. No other British comedian of the 20th century achieved this. It was not a career. It was mythology. The young fans adored him. They called him camp, that elastic, glittering word that describes a certain theatrical knowingness, a wink. They wore the campness like a badge, not understanding, because how could they? That what they perceived as style was survival. Frankie was not camp because it was fashionable. He was camp because it was the only way he could be himself in public without being destroyed. The flamboyance was not decoration. It was the last thin membrane between the truth and the world. But inside, behind the standing ovations, the mechanism was failing. He was past 70. His heart was weakening. His breathing was labored. Heymer could see it, the greyness of the skin, the slowness of the step, the way he gripped the back of a chair when he thought no one was watching. Heymer begged him to stop, to rest, to let the standing ovations be the final chord. Frankie could not stop. The stage was the only place where he felt alive. Take away the stage, and what remained? An old man in a stone house who had spent his entire life pretending. The stage was the last drug, stronger than LSD, stronger than barbiturates, stronger, perhaps, even than love, because love required honesty, and honesty was the one thing he had never been able to afford. In 1990, a BBC documentary crew, filming for the Arts Strand Arena, captured him backstage before a performance. The footage is remarkable for what it reveals. An elderly man, pale, heavy, visibly unwell. He stands in the wings. An assistant asks, "Are you all right?" No answer. His face is blank, exhausted, frightened. He looks like a man about to collapse. Then, from beyond the curtain, the sound of applause, and something happens, a shift, a settling, a mechanism engaging with an almost audible click like a key turning in a lock. The face rearranges itself, the shoulders straighten, the eyes brighten. The persona descends or ascends, depending on your perspective, and Frankie Howerd walks onto the stage. The audience erupts. For 90 minutes he stammers and stumbles and confides and protests, and the hall shakes with laughter. And he feeds on it. He draws it in like oxygen. For 90 minutes he is alive. Truly, electrically, incandescently alive. And then he walks off stage, and the act ends. And what is left is a face, old, drawn, infinitely weary, that belongs to a man who has spent 73 years on earth and not one day as himself. Or had he? That was the question. His last public performances were stripped bare, small venues, university halls, comedy clubs, one man and a microphone, no set, no costume, no ancient Rome. Just Frankie Howerd, standing alone, talking, the purest form of his art, and the most brutal because in this format there was nowhere to hide. The circle of those who knew the truth remained small and loyal. Cilla Black, one of his closest friends, one of the handful of people to whom the code words manager and companion were transparent, continued to visit, to telephone, to be present. One of the last known photographs shows him smiling with Cilla, one of the few people who knew the truth and had never turned away. In a life defined by concealment, her friendship was one of the things that was exactly what it appeared to be. Barry Cryer, comedian-writer, a man who had worked with Frankie and understood the machinery of his genius, was another. A tiny constellation of people who saw him with Heymer and understood, and who performed the daily act of courtesy that the English have elevated to an art form. They noticed nothing. They said nothing. They protected by looking away. It was not betrayal. It was the only kind of love that Frankie could accept, a love that was invisible and deniable. At Christmas 1991, Frankie and Dennis traveled to the Amazon basin, an unlikely destination for two Englishmen of a certain age. The heat pressed against them like a wall. The jungle hummed and screeched and dripped. Frankie wore a Panama hat and sat beside a river the color of strong tea and watched birds he could not name wheel across a sky that had never heard of the BBC. Perhaps Heymer wanted to give him an adventure. Perhaps Frankie wanted to go somewhere so distant from England that he could, for a week, forget who he was. Somewhere no one would recognize him. Somewhere the name Frankie Howerd meant nothing. In the jungle, he contracted a viral infection. high temperature, difficulty breathing. Heymer, alarmed, arranged their return, doctors, antibiotics. Frankie recovered, but not fully. Something had broken. The heart, already weakened by decades of stress and chemicals and sleepless nights, had absorbed a final blow. Heymer watched him fade, day by day, a little greyer, a little slower, a little more careful on the stairs. But Frankie continued to plan. He discussed new projects. He telephoned agents. He talked about dates and venues and running orders. He could not stop. To stop would be to admit that the end was near, and the end was not merely the end of a body. It was the end of the act. The final fall of the curtain on a show that had been running without intermission for 46 years. On Sunday, the 19th of April, 1992, in a flat in Fulham, anonymous, rented, a London base far from Somerset, Frankie Howerd picked up the telephone. He was discussing a new show. His voice, by the account of the person on the other end of the line, was weak, but he was making plans. He was talking about the future. He was, in other words, performing the last act. The words were coming, the familiar words, the professional words, and then they stopped. Heart failure. Quiet. No sirens. No crash team. No dramatic last words. Simply a cessation. A mechanism that had been running for 75 years came to a halt. The telephone receiver dangled. The voice at the other end called his name once, twice, and received no answer. Somewhere in the flat, or in Somerset, or at the other end of a telephone line that had just gone dead, Dennis Heymer learned that it was over, not the performance. What was over was the man, the body, the breathing, the voice that had stammered and stumbled and complained about shirts and said once to a woman who loved him enough not to flinch, "I wish to God I wasn't gay." That voice was silent now. And the silence it left behind was of a different kind from all the silences that had come before, because this one would not be broken. Not by a punchline, not by a kettle, not by anything. He made the calls that needed to be made, to Betty, the sister, to the doctor, to the agents. In none of those calls could he say what was true. "I have lost the love of my life." He said instead, in a voice trained by 34 years of concealment, "Mr. Howerd has passed away." The formal name, the public name, even in death the act held. The following day, the 20th of April, Benny Hill died. Another comedian, another solitary man, another life consumed by an industry that feeds on laughter and leaves loneliness behind. The newspapers confused the dates. The obituaries blurred. 2 clowns, 2 days, 2 deaths. In death, as in life, the clowns were interchangeable. The audience did not much mind which one had gone. What mattered was that another would come along soon enough. Frankie was buried at St. Gregory's Church in the village of Ware, Somerset, near the house, near the silence. On the gravestone the name read, Frankie Howerd OBE, not Francis Alec Howard. The character, not the man, even carved in stone. Dennis Heymer lived on, 17 years, alone at Wavering Down. What did he do with those years? We do not entirely know. He maintained the archive, hundreds of pages of handwritten scripts, annotated with pauses, sighs, hesitations. He walked the dogs until there were no more dogs to walk. He answered letters from fans who did not know they were writing to the person who had kept their hero alive. He sat in the kitchen that he had cooked in for 34 years and drank tea alone in a house that was suddenly, impossibly, too large for one. Did he miss him? Of course he missed him. But miss is too small a word for what happens when the person who gave your life its shape and its purpose and its daily rhythm disappears, and the rhythm stops, and you are left standing in a silence that is no longer protective but simply empty. In 2005, when Britain legalized civil partnerships, Heymer entered into one not with the ghost of Frankie, but with Chris Byrne, his carer, a man 40 years his junior. By all available accounts, it was a legal arrangement, a means of securing inheritance and care. But Dennis Heymer, who had spent 34 years concealing his heart, was not the kind of man to explain himself to journalists. We take him at his word, or more precisely, at his silence. In 2007, he sat before a BBC camera and for the first time in his life spoke publicly about what Frankie Howerd had been to him. 49 years after the Dorchester, 15 years after the death. He said simply that they had loved each other, that Frankie was the most difficult person he had ever known and the most wonderful. 4 quiet sentences, an entire life. In 2008, the BBC broadcast a drama called Rather You Than Me, starring David Walliams as Frankie. The film depicted alcoholism and hinted at childhood abuse by the father. Heymer was incandescent. He called it publicly false and unflattering and urged viewers not to watch. Betty, the sister, supported him. The accusations of paternal violence had no evidential basis. We stand in this account with the evidence. Where facts exist, we use them. Where only speculation exists, we say so. This is more honest and paradoxically more dramatic than any fiction. On a quiet day in 2009, Dennis Heymer died. He was 79. The archive, those hundreds of pages, the precise engineering of apparent chaos, was eventually transferred in 2021 to the Borthwick Institute at the University of York. The words went home. A boy born in York, and his words returned to York. The circle closed. After Frankie Howerd died, the world kept turning, as worlds do, and the laws that had shaped his life, that had bent it, stunted it, forced it into corridors too narrow for a human being to walk upright, began, slowly, painfully, with the reluctance of a nation that does not enjoy admitting it was wrong, to change. Section 28 was repealed in 2003, 11 years after his death. Civil partnerships became legal in 2004. Same-sex marriage became legal in England and Wales in 2014. In 2017, the so-called Turing Law, an amendment to the Policing and Crime Act, granted automatic posthumous pardons to thousands of men convicted of historical homosexual offences. Frankie Howerd was not among them. He could not be. He had never been convicted. He had slipped through the net, through luck, through caution, through the protective camouflage of fame, or perhaps through calculations made in rooms whose records remain sealed. The law had not broken his bones. It had broken something else, something harder to name and impossible to pardon, because there is no statute for the rehabilitation of a soul. You cannot pass an act of parliament that gives a dead man back the years he spent in hiding. You cannot legislate courage into a life that was lived in fear. You cannot retroactively grant someone the right to hold hands in the street, to introduce his partner at a dinner party, to say the word love without checking first who might be listening. The state grew tired of cruelty before it grew ashamed of it. The world that exists now, a world in which gay men and women lead governments, adopt children, marry in cathedrals, appear on the covers of magazines, live openly and unremarkably and boringly, in the best possible sense of the word, boring. would have been unimaginable to the man who sat in the Dorchester and fell in love over a bottle of wine and was terrified by it. "I wish to God I wasn't gay," those 6 words, spoken in anguish to a friend who would not judge him, sound now as though they come from another century. But they do not come from another century. They come from this one, from England, from a time that is not ancient history but recent memory. The people who enforced those laws, who filed those reports, who conducted those prosecutions, many of them are still alive. The country that made Frankie Howerd into a prisoner of his own personality did not change because it experienced a sudden enlightenment. It changed because enough people, over enough years, fought hard enough and loudly enough, and suffered visibly enough that the cost of persecution eventually exceeded the cost of tolerance. This is not a story of moral awakening. It is a story of exhaustion. In York, the city where Francis Alec Howerd was born on a cold March morning in 1917, there is a memorial plaque. It was erected by the York Civic Trust. It bears his name. It gives his dates. It says a few words about his career. It says nothing about Dennis Heymer, nothing about 34 years of hidden love, nothing about the terror or the LSD or the barbiturates or the prayers to a God who did not answer or the mother whose hymns echoed in his head long after she was gone. The plaque is, in its way, the final performance. Bronze, permanent, telling the public what it wants to know and concealing what it does not wish to see. At the University of York, the archive rests in its catalogue boxes, hundreds of pages. Handwritten scripts, annotated in Frankie's cramped, anxious hand. Stage directions that no audience ever saw. Pause here. Breathe. Stammer for 2 seconds, not 3, 2. Look at the audience as if you have forgotten what you were going to say. Wait. Wait longer. Now speak. The architecture of apparent chaos, preserved in ink and paper. These pages are the closest we shall ever come to seeing behind the act. Not the face itself, that is gone, but the mechanism, the gears and springs and counterweights. They are technical documents in a sense, but they are also the most intimate things Frankie Howerd ever produced, more revealing than the autobiography, more honest than any interview, more naked than the LSD sessions on the psychiatrist's couch. Because in these pages you can see the work, you can see the effort, you can see how monstrously, relentlessly, exhaustingly hard it was to be this good at appearing this bad. So, who was he? Not the character. Not the stammering, bewildered, perpetually flustered figure who stood before the camera and said, "Titter ye not," and made a nation laugh. That was a construction, brilliant, durable, and in the end, inescapable. Not the public man, Frankie Howerd OBE, star of stage, screen and radio, 3 times risen from professional death, a national institution in the same category as red telephone boxes and the shipping forecast. That was a label. Who was Francis Alec Howerd when no one was looking? He was a man of contradictions so profound that they did not cancel each other out, but coexisted uneasily, like 2 melodies played simultaneously in different keys. He wanted to be a serious actor and became the greatest clown of his generation. He wanted to be ordinary and was incurably unique. He wanted to be loved and pushed away those who loved him. He feared exposure and spent every moment on stage exposing himself, not the facts of his life, but the texture of his anxiety, the rhythm of his dread, the sound of a man fighting to stay afloat. His dishonesty was, paradoxically, the most transparent thing about him. He lied about his age. He lied about his feelings. He lied about who he was. And the lies were so thin, so gossamer fine, that the truth showed through them like bone through skin. He was tender. Heymer knew this. The tenderness was not for the public. It was for the kitchen at Wavering Down, for the dogs that lay at his feet, for the cup of tea made without asking, for the particular silence of two people who have been together long enough that language is no longer necessary. He could be sharp. Heymer knew this too, self-absorbed, demanding in ways that exhausted even the most patient companion. But the sharpness was the outer edge of a fear so deep that kindness felt dangerous, because kindness required lowering your guard, and lowering your guard was something Frankie Howerd had taught himself over 75 years of relentless practice never to do. And he was, in the end, very funny. Let us not forget this, because the tragedy must not be allowed to swallow the comedy. He made people laugh. Millions of people over 5 decades, across every medium that existed in his lifetime. He made them laugh not with wit alone, not with timing alone, not with the carefully calibrated architecture of his scripts alone, but with something rarer and more precious. The spectacle of a human being struggling, visibly, audibly, to keep going. His audiences did not know the nature of the struggle. They thought it was a man fighting with words. It was a man fighting with himself. And they laughed because the fight was valiant and absurd and recognizable, because everyone, in some small corner of their life, knows what it feels like to stand before a room and pretend. In Sondheim's musical, the slave Pseudolus dreams of freedom and in the final scene receives it. The chains fall away. The audience cheers. The curtain comes down on a man who is at last himself. Frankie's story did not end that way. There was no final scene in which the chains fell away. There was a flat in Fulham and a telephone and a conversation about a show that would never happen, and then nothing. And a man, somewhere in England, at the other end of a line that had just gone dead, who could not say what was true. Who said instead, in a voice that had been trained by 34 years of concealment to reveal nothing, "Mr. Howerd has passed away." Think of that evening at the Dorchester, a dining room, white linen, the clink of silver, a man with trembling hands and a career in ruins and a secret that could destroy him. A young man with a bottle of wine and a German surname and a steady gaze that, for reasons neither of them could explain, made the first man want to stop performing. Just for a moment, just for the length of a glance. They were together for 34 years. They shared a house. They shared dogs. They shared a particular kind of silence, the kind that exists between two people who know everything about each other and have agreed, without discussion, that the knowing is enough. When it was all over, when the telephone had gone dead, and the newspapers had confused the dates with Benny Hill's, and the gravestone had been carved with the name of the character rather than the man, Dennis Heymer sat in front of a camera and said, "We were together. We loved each other. He was the most difficult person I ever knew, and the most wonderful." 4 sentences, 34 years, a lifetime of silence broken at last in 20 words. A stone house in Somerset, Wavering Down, empty now. The dogs are long gone. The kettle does not whistle, dust on the windowsill. Beyond the glass, the hills of Somerset, unchanged by anything that has happened or failed to happen within these walls. And somewhere far away, in a university library in York, in an archive box with a catalogue number, hundreds of pages lie in the dark. Pages covered in a cramped, hurried hand, annotations in the margins, stage directions for an audience that will never assemble. Pause, breathe, stammer, 2 seconds, not 3, look up, wait, wait longer, now speak. Titter ye not. The words hang in the air, 3 small words, a comedian's catchphrase, nothing more. But listen to them again. Listen the way you listen to a familiar song after you have learned the story behind it, when every note carries a weight that the melody alone cannot explain. Listen, and you will hear not a joke but a confession, not a command but a plea, not an entertainer's patter but the voice of a man who spent his whole life saying, "Do not look too closely. Do not see what I am hiding. Do not ask me to be real, because being real is the one thing I was never allowed to be." Or perhaps, listen again, you will hear something else entirely. Perhaps you will hear a man who was real in the only way he could be every single night for 46 years. A man who took his fear and his loneliness and his longing and turned them into something that made strangers happy. A man whose act was not a barrier between himself and the world, but a gift to it, the only gift he knew how to give. Which version is true? Both. Neither. The answer depends on where you stand and how much you are willing to forgive, and whether you believe that a life lived in hiding can still be a life lived fully. Perhaps, and this is the thought that will not leave, the performance was him. Perhaps the stammering, anxious, endlessly performing figure was not a disguise covering the real Francis Howerd, but the truest version of himself he could produce, the only self that could survive in the world he was given. Not a lie, but a translation. Not a wall, but a window, the only window through which his particular light could pass without being extinguished. Like a tree that has grown around a fence wire until the wire is inside the bark, invisible, inseparable, part of the living wood. If that is so, then the laughter was not misplaced. The audiences were not deceived. They were laughing at a truth told in the only language available. And their love, however partial, however ignorant of the full picture, was not wasted. It reached him. Through the grease paint and the script and the carefully timed stammer, it reached him, and it kept him alive, not free, not happy exactly, but alive. Which is, when you consider the alternatives, when you think of Hancock's vodka and Williams's pills and Hawtrey's empty house by the sea, no small thing. In the end, a question remains. Frankie Howerd could not answer it. Dennis Heymer chose not to. The law has no language for it. The archive in York preserves it but does not resolve it. The question is this: how many faces do we ourselves wear, and do we know the one beneath them? Everyone has their own answer. Thank you for listening.